Principles of Accounting, Chapter 10. In Chapter 9, we looked at variance analysis from the actual to budgeted results, looking at a flexible budget. In Chapter 10, we extend that variance analysis into our manufacturing areas of materials, labor, and overhead. So we start by having standards or our norms for performance. We have price standards and quantity standards for production. These standards are the numbers that we use when we create our budgets, like we did in Chapter 8. So if you remember in Chapter 8, when we made our direct material and direct labor budgets, that we saw information about how much of a direct material was required for a unit and how much that direct material cost, how much direct labor was required, and how much that direct labor cost. Those are standards, and those are the standards that we use for budgeting. So our direct material standard is just the standard price per unit of our materials that we generally pay for, that we use for our budgets. Our standard quantity per unit is the number of materials that we use in each unit of production. Much like direct labor standards, we have a standard rate. That rate that we use in budgeting is usually an average. So we probably start people at one wage, and then after a year, we have different areas where we bump them up in pay. And so the single rate that we use is generally an average for direct labor. And then the standard number of hours per unit. So if it takes a half an hour per unit or an hour per unit. And our variable overhead. Our variable rate is the variable portion of our predetermined overhead rate, and our quantity is whatever our allocation base is for predetermined overhead. So labor or machine hours or any other allocation base we would use for overhead allocation. This is an example of a standard cost card. So in this standard cost card, we see that we use 3 pounds of materials for each unit of production, and we pay $4 per pound for units. And you can tell that we apply our variable manufacturing overhead on the basis of direct labor hours, looking at what our direct labor hour is for production. So how do we use this information in variance analysis? Well, we look at last week in Chapter 9, when we looked at the difference between the actual and the flexible budget, that was a spending variance. We can break those spending variances down further into price variances and quantity variances. And the model for doing that variance analysis for the 3 variable inputs, direct materials, direct labor, and our variable overhead is here. So we have our actual quantity of input at actual price. So that's our actual results. And then we have the actual quantity of input at a standard price. And then the third one is the standard quantity allowed for actual output at standard price. And what that means is if we go back and look at this standard card. So when we say the actual quantity, so if we say we made 40,000 units, then our standard quantity allowed for actual output for 40,000 units would be 40,000 times 3 pounds, because that's our direct materials, times $4 per pound. So we'll look at an example. So we make a mountain parka, and we use 0.1 kilograms of fiberfill per parka, and our standard price is $5 per kilogram. Last month, we used 210 kilograms of fiber fill to make 2,000 parkas. Our total materials cost was $1,029. So our cost, $1,029. That's our actual result. We would then look at our actual results, $1,029. Our standard quantity and standard price, we have on this previous slide, you see that we use 1 kilogram of fiber fill. So we would take 2,000 parkas times 0.1, and that is how we get the 200 kilograms of fiber fill. So that's standard quantity. And our standard price is $5 per kilogram. So our standard quantity at standard price is 1,000. Our actual quantity ended up being 210 kilograms, and our standard price of $5 is 1,050. And then our actual quantity times actual price was 1,029. So we have a quantity variance that is $50 unfavorable and a price variance that is $21 favorable. So we saved money on the price, but then we used more than we had budgeted for, than our standards said we were going to use. So who's responsible for price variances and quantity variances? Well, usually for a price variance, it is the purchasing manager who is responsible for controlling our prices. However, the production manager can result in variances that aren't the fault of the purchasing manager. So if I'm the production manager and I don't get information to the purchasing manager in time about the materials that I need, the purchasing manager can't shop for the best price. The quantity variance is the production manager's fault, or who is responsible for making sure that the right number of materials are used in production. However, if we have a really favorable price variance, that could be the result of the purchasing manager buying poor quality materials that cost us a lot less money, then that quantity variance would be the fault of bad materials. We could have increased scrap or increased waste because of poor quality materials, either ripping or be not good enough to use, being damaged in some way. Our labor variances, so we have each parka takes 1.2 hours of direct labor at a rate of $10 per hour. Last month, we actually worked 2,500 hours at a total labor cost of $26,250 to make 2,000 parkas. So for 2,000 parkas, if we take 2,000 times 1.2 standard hours, we should have used 2,400 hours. So we can already see before going to the next slide that we have an overage in labor hours. So our actual hours and our actual rate gives us the rate of $26,250. We should have used 24 hours given our standard number of hours per parka and the number of parkas we made. Our actual usage was 2,500 hours. So we have an unfavorable efficiency variance and an unfavorable rate variance. So who is responsible for labor variances? Generally, our production manager is who is held responsible for labor variances because they influence the schedule, the quality of supervision, the quality of training provided to these employees, which employees are scheduled, which tasks. So we could have had a labor efficiency variance that's caused by newer employees who haven't been trained yet, taking more time. We can also create materials variances caused by that. If we have training employees that haven't been trained yet, that are taking a lot of time and are wasting a lot of materials, we can fix those variances by offering more employee training. Can we control the labor variances? Well, our labor variances aren't always entirely controllable by just the production manager. We also have the maintenance department manager who's responsible for maintaining our production equipment. If our production equipment breaks down a lot, then we will have an unfavorable quantity variance for labor because we're always taking extra time for broken down machines. The same as I had said, if the purchasing manager purchases a bunch of lower quality materials, that takes a lot longer to assemble because we're having to sort through and find the decent materials. We're having to sort through a bunch of scrap and waste. Next, our variable manufacturing overhead. So we use our standard labor hours. We have 1.2 hours per parka. And we have a variable overhead rate of $4 per labor hour. We already know that we worked 100 hours more than our standard hours allowed based on our labor variance. Now we can look at how did that affect our variable manufacturing overhead that was applied. So our actual variable overhead was $10,500. Our actual amount applied would have been the 2,500 hours at our rate of $4 per hour. And then we know from the labor, our standard hours would have been 2,400 labor hours at our variable overhead rate of $4 per hour. So we have a $400 unfavorable efficiency variance and a $500 unfavorable rate variance. So our variable overhead costs 20 cents more per hour in actual cost than our application of overhead material. The advantages of using standard costs are that we can provide benchmarks that promote economy and efficiency. It also simplifies our bookkeeping records, makes it easier to budget, support our responsibility accounting systems that we're going to be looking at in Chapter 11, and that management by exception approach, where we can look at the variance analysis, how we varied from our standards. So there are a lot of advantages to using standard costs or budgeted costs, but there are also problems with using standard costs. So standard potential problems are that when we prepare our variance reports, they might contain information that is outdated. If these variances are used to negatively reinforce employees or to punish employees, then we can have suffering from morale, especially if it actually wasn't a result of the employees that caused a negative variance. For example, a negative price variance can just be caused by the increased supply and demand. That could just be an economic issue that caused a materials price variance from our standard. We know that costs fluctuate based on things that are completely outside of the company's control. Our labor variances also assume that our entire production process is labor-based. So that's not always true if we have a highly automated manufacturing environment. And we might put too much emphasis on meeting specific standards that can take us out of strategic alignment or looking at other business objectives that we should be looking at. That's the end of chapter 10, but we're also going to cover the appendix, the first appendix for chapter 10, which covers fixed overhead variances. So our fixed overhead variances is really the difference between our actual fixed overhead, our budgeted fixed overhead, and then the amount of fixed overhead that has been applied based on our allocation method. So we have a budget variance between what the actual and budgeted amount is, and a volume variance between the applied and the budgeted. The total fixed overhead variance, as we'll see later, is the same amount as our under and over applied. So when we're looking at fixed overhead variances, we know that we have budgeted production, we're using machine hours, so we have our budgeted machine hours, then we have our actual production, the standard machine hours allowed for the actual production, and our actual machine hours. We then have our rates. So we're budgeted variable manufacturing overhead and our fixed manufacturing. So remember, we already looked at the variable manufacturing overhead variances. So what we want from this variance analysis is only the fixed manufacturing overhead rate. So we want to remove any of the variable information. So we're going to look at this predetermined overhead rate. So we have 360,000 in predetermined overhead and 90,000 machine hours. That gives us a rate of $4 per machine hour. Then as we go to the next slide, we see that $1 per machine hour is the variable component and $3 is the fixed component. It's the fixed component that we want to use in our analysis. So we can see here that the fixed component of our predetermined overhead rate is 270,000. So that's our budgeted fixed overhead, 270,000. The fixed overhead applied to work in process is based on those actual machine hours used. And then we have our actual fixed overhead. So we have a budget variance that is 10,000 unfavorable and then a volume variance that is 18,000 unfavorable. And our total fixed overhead variance is 28,000 unfavorable. In a standard cost system, that total 28,000 unfavorable would equal the under applied overhead. If it was a favorable variance, that would equal the over applied overhead. And then if we remember from several chapters back that over and under applied overhead gets written off at the end of each period to cost of goods sold. That is all for chapter 10.